This is that interesting moment, like being at a party and standing in the kitchen thinking, did I send the invites out? Yes. So people are starting to join in, which is excellent. We'll wait for a couple of minutes just while people file in and join this evening's public engagement event. I'll just give it a couple more minutes, but in the meantime, welcome to everybody who has joined us so far, and we'll get cracking in just a couple of minutes. So I just wonder whether, Andrew, you're just able to adjust your camera slightly. Ah, that's better. Thank you. So we're waiting for a few more people, and hopefully they've got a note of when we were starting, but we have already got a dozen or so people have joined in, which is great. Looking forward to hearing people's thoughts once we've begun the presentation. So if I can, I think we'll give it one more minute, if that's okay with my panelists. I know people hoping to catch the last sunny evening of the autumn. Right. My name is Spencer Neal. I work for a public relations and community engagement organisation called Keeble Brown, and we're working on behalf of Retirement Villages Group. And we're delighted to welcome you this evening to the public engagement for what we're referring to as the Watford Road scheme. And I will just run through a few kind of house rules, if you like, First of all, we are recording this, so welcome everybody. And the recording will be just neatened up for kind of sound and quality, and then made available online for sharing and viewing by the public and by stakeholders. And I know that the local planning authority has also asked if they can see a copy of it once it's done, which is fantastic. Questions, I really do hope that you ask lots of good, interesting questions, which you can do via the Q&A function, which comes as part of the Zoom. And I'm sure that after all of the COVID and lockdown and stuff, I think we're all now familiar with Zoom and how it works, which is good. And then we're going to share screens. So the panel will introduce themselves in a second, but just to let you know that we'll be sharing screens so that you can see some of the drawings and images that the architects and the project team have put together. And that should both inform the presentation that my colleagues on the panel will be giving, but also help inspire some questions and suggestions and ideas from what I'm going to refer to as the audience. But I appreciate that you are the community of Elstree and Borough Wood, and we're delighted to have you here for this engagement session. So if my colleague Will could share screens, that'd be great, and then we can get cracking. So, as I said, we're referring to the project as Watford Road, Elstree, and it is the public engagement, the first formal public engagement that we've had for the designs, which will, we hope, form the basis of a planning application that will be submitted in the coming months. RVG, Retirement Villages Group, as you know from the information that we've been circulating locally, would be the developer, the owner, the manager of the integrated retirement community, assuming that it goes ahead. And they've brought together a team of specialist consultants to ensure that we have the right level of expertise and specialism to help make sure that the scheme is able to kind of bring forward all of the benefits that you'd expect for a village like Elstree. So I'm going to ask my panelists if they could just quickly introduce themselves, name, and then just briefly their role in the project at this stage. And I will start with Guy Flintoft from Retirement Villages Group.
Thanks, Spencer, and good evening, everyone. Great to have a selection of the community of Elstree with us here this evening. Yeah, as Spencer says, I'm Guy Flintoft. I work for Retirement Villages Group, and my job title is Planning and Design Director. So it does what it says on the tin. I'm responsible for planning projects, anything that requires planning permission, deeply involved in the design of developments and very much in engaging with communities because we're long-term investors in the places that we bring forward our retirement communities.
Thank you. And perhaps if we could hear from Richard McWilliam.
Thank you, Spencer. Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard McWilliam. I'm a landscape architect and I head up quite a sizable team of landscape architects with both design and landscape planning expertise. We are really, really interested in making this a really first-class landscape-led scheme. And I hope you contribute to our process of making it just exactly that.
Thank you, Richard. Andrew.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Andrew Mills. I'm a Senior Development Manager at Retirement Villages Group. I'm responsible for effectively the Elstree project for the business case and oversee the whole development cycle. So that's everything from everything through planning through to sale of the unit. So I welcome everyone to the forum tonight.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Lee, can we hear from you, because you have a key role in this evening's proceedings?
Yeah, I do. Good evening, everybody. My name's Lee Marsden. I'm an architect and project director for Coffee Architects, and Coffee Architects are they're the lead designers and architects for the project, and we're responsible for coordinating and assembling information from the various consultants on the team, including Richard here, the landscape architect, and the many other consultants, including tree consultant, engineering, sustainability, transport and highways. It's a very long list. So nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. And I see that Jane Jane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So hello, everybody. My name's Jane Harrison. I'm an associate town planner at Barton Wilmore, which is a planning and design consultancy. Richard's from Barton Wilmore as well, so we're colleagues. And our responsibility is preparing and submitting the planning application.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. Without further ado, this session will come to a close at 7 o'clock. So we've got a lot to share, and as I said at the outset, very much hoping to hear the questions from the people in the audience, but also we have had some questions during the early stages of our engagement when we were talking to people in the area, local shopkeepers and other stakeholders. So we've got some questions already, but I'm hoping that people joining us this evening will type their questions into the Q&A so that I can put them to the panel. If we would like to start with the next slide, please, Will. This is just to, I think, introduce everybody to retirement villages, and I think if I can hand across to Guy and Andrew to kind of talk us through the next few slides.
Yeah, thank you, Spencer. Yeah, so most people won't have heard of retirement villages as a group, but they might be familiar with the idea of retirement villages as a concept. So we're a company that's about 40 years old. I think our oldest retirement community, which is in Surrey, is 40 years old. And we build, and really importantly, we operate retirement communities across England, 16 of them at the moment, from as far flung as Cornwall to Lincolnshire, and will shortly be built a new retirement community in Chester, so extending our reach a little bit further north. And really, what is a retirement community? And the most important thing to understand is it's absolutely not a care home, because that's the most common misconception. We provide age-exclusive retirement communities that provide people with care and support, but where they live entirely independently. So people buy or rent a cottage or a bungalow or an apartment, which is entirely self-contained, like anyone else's home. They have complete control over the way they live their lives, but it's within a community where you have access to services and amenities, and where there's a really strong community spirit, where care is provided for people as and when they need it. So not a care home, very much a community. That's the only thing we do as a company. We don't build care homes, we don't build general market housing or supermarkets or anything else. We build and operate retirement communities, and it's our name.
Sorry to interrupt you, Guy, but just you've mentioned care homes and nursing homes and stuff. What specifically, because I know this is a question that came up when we were talking to people in the neighbourhood, what's the difference?
I mean, I think it's that point about independence and tenure. So a care home or a nursing home, one pays a license to occupy a room, and that room might be a small suite, but it's not a self-contained home. Staff have access, and I think you don't live independently within a care home. Within a retirement community, you live independently. Yes, there are amenities and services, and it's a community, but you engage in that as much or as little as you like. Your home has bathrooms and kitchens and living space, and you close the front door if you want to, or you enjoy being part of the community if you want to. So that's really the key difference, and either leased or rented in the way that other homes are leased or rented, rather than being on a license in the way that a care home is. Okay,
that's useful, because I know that I spoke to a gentleman called Stephen last week, and he telephoned up, and that was one of his questions. Sorry, so I interrupted you, but if you could perhaps...
Yeah, I mean, I was going to add that the history of the company is that we passed through a couple of different ownerships over the years. Privately funded business, living hand to mouth. In 2018, we were purchased by AXA, who people will know as a French insurance giant. So we're wholly owned and funded by AXA, and that gives us the ability to make quite significant investments in new communities. Since that point, since AXA acquired us, I think we've really reset what we think of in terms of retirement community and the way people want to live in retirement, the kind of amenities and services, the kind of locations, including, I think, moving from a kind of it'll sort of almost sort of gated feeling sense of location to something that's much more connected within existing communities, and really should be an amenity to those existing places where they're located, rather than being sort of somewhat isolated from them. We're bringing a lot of that ambition to our existing communities, but it's a lot easier and a lot more effective if you make that decision from the outset and how you locate your development. And there's a lot more about our new ambition, funded and backed by AXA, in terms of sustainability, etc., that will come through in the course of the presentation tonight as well.
So just again, picking up on another question, where do the people who move into one of your integrated communities, where do they come from?
Overwhelmingly from quite close to the site. So, if you think about the choices that people make in retirement, and the choices that you or I or our parents or friends might make, typically it's not about moving across the country to an entirely new location, but people tend to look for continuation in their retirement. So they'd be looking to stay in the communities that they're already part of. We would expect a very high proportion, probably more than half of residents, to come from within a 5 to 10 mile radius of the site. Some people move further, so it may be they're moving back to an area where they have historic connections, moving to be near family. My mum went through that thought process. She nearly moved back to Kent, where I live, to be nearer to me, but in the end stayed living in Windsor, moved to a retirement community in Windsor, about half a mile from where she already lived. So that's the general trend.
Thank you. So sustainability, it gets talked about a lot, and I suppose you're talking about sustainability. This is IBG, obviously. You have a strategy. How does that align with the local planning authority? I think that's probably one for Andrew or Guy.
I don't mind taking that one, as it's sort of related to planning, which is my field. Yeah, so I think, obviously we're all aware of the climate agenda, climate emergencies declared by many planning authorities, and local government is really doing its part through planning to try and bring in policies that align with the solutions to that agenda. So trying to encourage development to be more sustainable. We're very much motivated by our own beliefs and values in that area. We have a leader in the business, our CEO, who's very committed to sustainability. We also have AXA's global head of sustainability on our board. And there's some highlights in terms of what that means, the objectives that we set ourselves on the slide there. So, being more regenerative by being net zero carbon in all our operations by 2030. That's really reducing our environmental impact and our contribution to climate change, designing out waste. And, sustainability isn't just about climate change and carbon and energy. It's also about our local impact. So being part of communities and regenerating communities, being additive to them rather than just incidental to them. So that's just a snapshot of some of the things that we're trying to do.
Thank you. So we move on to the next slide, please, Will. So this is something that people hear about in the media, but what does it mean in the context of the scheme that's being proposed?
Yeah, so in Hertsmere, as in a lot of the country, the population is naturally aging, and that's not about people moving into the area from elsewhere. It's simply that there's a population boom that happened post-war and continued for some time, and as that sort of boom in the population ages, then we see that there's far more people, in this case, as we're showing, aged over 65 in areas like Hertsmere, and it's an attractive place where people form bonds and enjoy the environment and want to stay. So, I mean, these figures roughly, as you can see, show that from where we are now, or a couple of years ago, just under 20,000 people aged over 65 in Hertsmere, we get to well in excess of 25,000 by 2040. 25% growth in 20 years is really significant. Not unusual, but certainly characteristic in Hertsmere as it is in many other places.
Indicative of the quality of the area and its desirability as a place to linger, as you said, and put down roots.
Exactly, and as this shows, as a percentage of the population in the area, older people, move up from representing just over 18% to over 23% of the population. So it's a big trend. It's not new. We've been seeing it coming for a long time, but it continues some way into the future.
Thank you. And I think this is really just kind of showing similar things. We move on to the next slide. So I think this is perhaps going to be more interesting when we get into the detail of the site, and that I guess is for I don't know who wants to pick.
Spencer. Yeah. So I'll just talk a little bit about understanding how we understand Elstree further, and a bit about the site context. So obviously, I think from our perspective as a business, we recognise that in order to design a scheme in Elstree, we do need to understand about the history, the character of the village, and about the context of how a site could sit within that. So, it's important we get to know about things which are good about Elstree, and those which may be less so. So all of this helps shape and develop our own narrative, or the narrative for the scheme, and about how we feel we can integrate that within Elstree. So what you'll shortly hear from with Lee is in a few slides, we're starting to draw out our own thoughts on this relative to how our design might proceed. But obviously, an important part of that is how we do that by having a conversation, with the local community. So forums like today, and there'll be others, where we can start the conversation and get feedback. So I would, I'd ask that you do provide that feedback, and as our plans develop, we like to think that we'll be able to demonstrate how and what we can deliver, by our residents, through our residents integrating into the community, will all bring a positive contribution to living in Elstree. And I think that should be recognised, that could ripple further afield into Boreham Wood and the other surrounding areas, really. So if you jump next slide, Will. Yes, that's just the wider locality.
Sorry, Andrew, just to go back, just looking at Richard in the audience has said, and it was on that slide, the slide before this one, there is Elstree Pharmacy, and Richard has said that the GP surgery is likely to close, and that the pharmacy is also anxious about the sustainability of Elstree as a viable economic location. is that the sort of thing that would concern RVG?
Concern from the point of view that obviously that would be, I guess, reducing the vitality of any village. I think what our residents will come into the village will be able to, obviously use hopefully use village facilities, which will maybe help the pharmacy itself, and we also just generally find that actually residents who move into our communities, because of the way they have independent living, but are able to be supported as and when needed, that they have a less of a pressure on the local facilities, so less of pressure on the likes of the doctor's surgery and things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but Richard's been waiting for an answer for a little while. I thought I'd just interject. Next slide. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, next one after that. So I've just talked slightly. So I'll just talk a bit about the site itself. So from our side, we have we don't own the site. I think this to probably make that clear. It is owned by the pub company, who also own the Plough pub on the corner. We have an option. We actually have an option over the site, which we secured in 2019, and have since then been involved in making representations to the local council during the local plan process to secure an allocation for an integrated retirement community on this site. So obviously we're now aware that process has stopped. In terms of,
and I think people can look at the site, Andrew, and they'll say, so it's clearly in use now. What are your thoughts on its current use, and how might that change?
Yeah, obviously, so we're very aware that obviously it's used by Cecil's Horse Sanctuary at the moment, who do a lot of local work. That they have a grazing license to use the land. Certainly, as we go forward, we want to, and have reached out to the Cecil's team and trustees to work with them and existing landowners to get the support they need to prepare a plan to effectively relocate from the site. And I think it's important to say that we have the time to do that. There's no intention to be turning anyone out right now. So if we're able to set up a clear plan, everything can be relocated and done in a timely and orderly way. And I think ultimately that will help find a more sustainable long-term solution for Cecil's. And also, we recognise it's got to be done in the best interests of the animals first and foremost, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And that was something that came up. One of the questions, Duncan's come up with a question actually, which is because it's very clear that there's a finger of land that kind of comes into the site, and there is apparently there's a knotweed problem. Is that something that RVG would be able to, is that an RVG question or coffee? How would that be dealt with?
Well, in terms of our own surveys at the moment, we're obviously just in the process of doing a number of them. I'm not aware anything's come up at the moment. That's probably useful information to know, obviously, if it is on an adjoining site. So yeah, we need to speak to the wider team about that.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll go back and obviously the gentleman Duncan asked the question. He must know something. We can perhaps ask him.
Yeah.
For a bit more background. So thank you, Duncan. I hope that answers your question.
I think if I just move to the next slide, I think pass over to Lee now to pick up some commentary.
Thank you, Andrew. So the next few slides, really, we've walked the site, we've walked the kind of the streets and local areas around Elstree and Borough Wood, and we've done that with the whole team, the whole consultant team, and we like to do that just to get an understanding, to really get, as Andrew was saying, to understand the site, understand the history, and understand the area. And that's not to suggest in any way that we kind of haven't, you know, we know everything, and we're not suggesting we know everything at this stage. And that's the whole purpose of this consultation. And I'm very happy to be corrected in some of the observations I made, or for some to suggest we should have some other priorities, really. But the little plan in the bottom left-hand corner that are just showing there, that's just the plan of the kind of immediate area around the site. And what we've done there really is just to kind of identify what we see as kind of the sort of differing character areas around the environments around the perimeter of the site. So sort of going clockwise from the right hand side, or going anti-clockwise from the right hand side. There's what we call the kind of the high street character area, which is kind of the main part of the village high street. What we call the green edge. If you just stay on the previous slide just for a minute, which is kind of another area which we'll talk about. There's the Watford Road environments. Then we've an area we call the kind of the west of the high street, which is quite hidden away, and then the site itself. Just to start with.
So just before you, because you've made a good start, you've raised a question, and I think it was your reference to the green edge, and somebody has asked the question, which is how do we address the fact that our plans, how do we make sure that our plans are consistent with the site being green belt?
Is that rather than Lee from a design perspective? I mean, I think, you know, consistent with the character of the wider area is obviously one question which Lee and Richard as well, from a landscape perspective, you know, can address. But from I suspect the question probably is from a planning policy perspective. You know, greenbelt is a policy of constraint. Normally, you wouldn't expect to see development permitted there. As we said at the beginning, we were pursuing or promoting the site for development through the local plan process. The council had, I think, reached the view that that was a sensible proposition and had suggested a plan that did see the site removed from the green belt so that it could be developed in this way. Clearly, as that plan has stalled or will be revisited, that hasn't happened yet. So the site sits in the green belt, and we'll have to make our justification for it to be developed. So the need for housing, the benefits of the kind of specialist housing that we're talking about, and the other dynamics and planning policy issues. So we appreciate that it's a case to be made as an exception to the normal policy of constraint.
Thank you. I think that, yeah, as you say, it's a planning issue, and I think it was a technical point that the questioner was hoping to make. So hopefully that's helped answer the question. So Lee, sorry I interrupted, but it's an important question at this stage.
It's fine. Yeah, if we continue the kind of the whiz around the perimeter of the site. So Elstree High Street, like many high streets, has kind of undergone quite a lot of change over time. If you could just go back one more, Will, sorry. But it does have some interesting and notable buildings, and not least St Nicholas Church with its wonderful flint walls, and Shopworth Place further up, not to exclude other notable buildings, but there's a certain character of buildings and forms and use of brick that we found interesting in our walk around the site. But that is broken up a little bit towards the kind of the middle of the high street. If you go to the next slide, Will, with the presence of Watling Court, which is a set back from the high street, and that's the area that provides this kind of route and access through to that finger of sight that was just mentioned earlier, which is the kind of the area marked 2 on the little plan, which is contains a private car park, and that's the kind of area finger of sight that just that sort of juts into our proposal site. And that sort of sits behind this kind of 1960s housing development called Watling Court. But there are some interesting little along the high street. What is formed, and we found quite interesting, is little spaces, informal spaces between buildings and little alleyways and connections, which are quite interesting and characterful. Next slide. And then as you move to the kind of the south end of the high street, as it starts to meet Watford Road, obviously it's to facilitate the amount of traffic, volume of traffic, and as transport engineers tend to do, the road was widened at some point, and that involved the losing of a building historically, I think, which is next to the pub, to facilitate the widening of the road. So that starts to break up the high street between sort of the north end and effectively the south end, and ends up with quite a wide head to that road. And we know that Watford Road gets rather busy at certain times of day. But this is that kind of turn as you come around the high street. That's the first moment really we start to see, and you start to catch glimpses of the site itself. So that top view is right at the top, looking across, and then the bottom view is looking up Watford Road with the site on the left, and you can see that wide green verge that acts as well a good and helpful buffer between the busy road and the edge of the site. Next slide. And then moving into the site, I think these images are interesting because they show some of the great assets within the site and some of the things that can be improved really, as was just highlighted there within the site. That little plan there highlights the sort of cluster of trees that have got a tree preservation order on them as a group, but kind of equally important is the bottom center image is the fantastic central oak tree that sits in the middle of the site, and I think this photo belies the real scale and the grandeur of the tree there. But along the top again, it shows some of the rather densely wooded areas and opportunities for views and towards the north edge of the site, and views out across the plain along that green edge. So they're great assets and great opportunities for communities and use of the site there. But the centre image shows at the moment the room for improvement really, and this the kind of rather barren area really is a bit of a victim of the problems of drainage in the site, amongst other things, where it gets very barren and dry, and then certain areas get really quite flooded and boggy. So part of our challenge really is to resolve that in our proposals, within our landscape drainage proposals, to make
when we were talking about this with some of the people that we met when we were doing our walkabout, and we talked about the kind of fantastic internal landscape, people were asking, well, what's in it for them? I mean, they perhaps weren't quite so blunt, but I think that's what they were asking. Would any of these kind of landscape opportunities be available to the wider public, or is it just be RBG's residents?
It's not exclusive, and the walks and it's not an inward-looking development, so it is accessible, and particularly the walks around the site. And you'll see in the plans that we'll show later on how those routes and connections can start to work and knit into the wider village. Okay,
yeah, and the other thing, just again picking up on the top right hand corner, there is the entrance into the site as it stands, but then in the bottom left hand corner I can see that there's a couple of what look like kind of entrances on that boundary there. Do you have envisaged changes to the way that the site is accessed?
I think it'd be better explained on a later slide. So if I can hold that point and come back when we come on to another slide, I think it might be easier and clearer for everyone to see.
Great, thank you.
So if we just move on to the next slide, and I'll note that one, I'll come back to that. So a few other things that are kind of, again, not immediately apparent if you look at photographs of the site, unless you've really walked the site and wandered around. There's an incredible topography on the site. It slopes equivalent of four building stories from one corner to the other, which is substantial, and it's a considerable challenge, both for the construction of the buildings and for landscape, and to make those routes work and connections work, and to make it a suitable place as a retirement village. So that's, you can see there on the section at the top, the height difference between the houses on Land's End on the left hand side, and then the high street just on the right hand side there. Next slide. And sort of put this this plan is one of our study plans, really just identifying the current planting and trees on the site. So as I mentioned earlier, the oak that sits right in the centre of the site, in perfect position, fortunately. And then just the left-hand side here on this image, the cluster of trees, which they're subject to a group tree preservation order. So they, as part of our proposals, they won't be touched. They may be, and Richard can maybe expand on this a little bit later. But ultimately, that's retained as a group of trees and managed. And then we've got this cluster towards the north of the site, of a mix of large and small trees, which again, trying to work, we're always trying to work within with these natural assets of the site and think about how we can develop a scheme that works with rather than against these schemes, so against these existing trees. So while there might be some, necessarily be some adjustments to trees and some adjustments to smaller trees, the majority we're seeking to retain within our proposals.
And going back to the gradient point, to what extent would the new scheme block the views of the existing neighbouring properties?
Well, that's where the gradient's an advantage in many ways, because we can think about how those buildings, and we're still in the emerging proposals, but we can think very carefully when working with that gradient. We can make sure that buildings are kept away from boundaries and they're away from neighbours and are a suitable height. So again, in our sort of later slides, you'll start to see some emerging proposals for that.
Thanks, and that's Sandra asking that question from the audience.
It's probably worth noting, sorry, just on that front. I mean, one of the things, the reason for working with this TPO cluster is we're very mindful of the houses on the lower end at Land's End. So by keeping buildings away from that edge, that's a good thing for that boundary.
Yeah, thank you.
So thinking about how, I mean, the site itself, you can see here it's sort of deeply embedded and ingrained within the village itself. And we just kind of starting to, as we're working through, and this is just showing our kind of proposal, our sort of method of working through this, really, looking at the kind of key constraints and opportunities for the site and just kind of noting them and recording them. So what is notable from the kind of right to left, really, is the site itself. There is no access from the high street, directly from the high street, through some of these gaps between the buildings, between Watling Court and the pub. Although you can walk between the two, it's private land, so there's no opportunity to get into the site or have entrances into the site. So the primary frontage is along Watford Road, and that's an important kind of starting point. Mentioned earlier, Spencer, about the entrances into the site, and you'll see marked along Watford Road there, where we've nominally marked 2 points of entrance. And this is where we've identified as part of our sort of emerging proposals, along with some consultancy from our transport and highways engineer, the kind of optimum positions to gain access into the site. And that's thinking about providing the right traffic flows to make sure they're safe entrances, and importantly for the one that's marked with the cursor at the moment there, to make sure that's away from the kind of the head of the high street where it's most busy. What we don't want to do though is go in right in the middle of the site, because then it starts to bring cars right where we're thinking about keeping the oak tree, keeping trees. So it's a balance between landscape and highways conversations, and that's where we started to kind of set those positions. The one on the left is actually pretty much where there's an existing access anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And
in terms of the impact on traffic flows and so on Watford Road, how does that affect traffic?
Well, again, I mean, we're still assessing that with the transport engineers, but one of the key things is 2 entrances are going to be better than 1, because we'll reduce the flow from each individual entrance into the site. So again, it's something to be managed and worked through as we develop proposals with our transport consultants.
Thank you.
And then maybe just go back, I think it's probably just I think what's just the last kind of point on here is really the real, you can see here that no drawing really gets that sense of the thick green edge to the northern edge there, and that acts as a great buffer to the development along that northern edge. So it's a strong consideration as we develop proposals.
So where the cursor is hovering over at the moment, that edge there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next, I think I'm talking to the next section. So we kind of set out here some our kind of emerging or our sort of design approach and design objectives. And there's three key things here, and we're still starting to hear them as we're talking about the site, but the importance of landscape and sustainability, and working with the existing terrain, vegetation, ecology, and that's a super important starting point. But then thinking very carefully about openness and inclusivity, so making sure that ideas about the site and landscape are not inward looking, and this is really important. So this is about thinking about proposals that engage with the wider community and are open and connect into wider Elstree, and explore and maximize opportunity for benefit to the wider village. And then,
sorry, really, that does actually tie into a question from Rachel, which is, will the pub on the corner be included in your design scheme?
It's not within our site, but I do. There are proposals. I understand there are proposals coming forward to reopen the pub. I don't know whether Guy or Andrew can give a little bit more detail on that.
Andrew,
or shall I continue?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
The question, it was just a question about Andrew. It's just a question about the kind of status of the pub and reopening. And I was just saying that I think there is a timetable, a loose timetable for the pub to reopen.
Yes, sorry, there is. Yeah, well, yes, there is. Yeah, that they have their own plans, I believe, which they'll be bringing forward later on in the year. But yeah, that's as much as kind of I'm aware of at the moment. But they are planning to do something there.
Mm-hmm. So it's not perhaps the full answer that Rachel was hoping for, but this is probably not the right forum for that at this stage. Sorry, Lee, thank you. You talk about benefits to the wider community, and I know that access to sort of public amenity and shared spaces is going to be key to kind of bringing a bit more vitality back to the village. Absolutely, and that could be, I think we're still looking at opportunities for that, as well as within the Retirement Villages Group kind of communals offer. There's other opportunities for other functions within that, which we'll sort of come on to. And then the last of the three kind of key design objectives is about being visually responsive and complementary. And that's where, as we start to develop proposals, we're thinking very carefully about how materially and physically and massing wise the buildings can kind of complement both the high street and the architecture we see in the high street and the wider townscape. And that's something that as we get into more detail, we'll be thinking about very carefully. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide. So we've just got a few more slides now, just talking through our kind of our design strategy. We start to set out the kind of key parameters. So the first one, which I talked about already, is important that we're building a community around the central retained oak tree, and that's a kind of starting point, not the exclusion of any other of the kind of tree assets, but the oak tree is a really important part of that consideration, and sort of the beginning of the whole improvement of the biodiversity of the site. Next slide. And then the second objective is this experience centered on wellness and outdoor experiences. I think there's a photographer much more famous than I am once said, in the end, we'd all rather be outside. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the idea with such a great site to build in
the opportunity for exploring the landscape routes, meeting people outside, places to dwell and sit is super important. And with that, we look at ways where we can actually we can measure that as well, using things like the Fitwell certification. Next slide. And then this is called the managing the impact of cars, really, but it should really be called pedestrians first. So we know we need cars on the site, and that we need to provide parking and the right amount of parking. But a key strategy is to make sure the parking doesn't become the central feature. So thinking very carefully about how we control that. That's part of the reason why cars come in around the perimeter of the site. Yeah,
and I think actually it's a good point to just bring Jane in, perhaps, just to kind of go back to that query about traffic and how that might be managed, and the kind of impact that the cars associated with this scheme might have on the wider community.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I think it's important to note that the demographic and the residents have a different car usage pattern than we would typically expect with normal housing. So they're less likely to be travelling in rush hour periods and the particularly busy periods of getting to work or doing school drop-offs and what have you. So there's a different demographic and usage there. Generally, the car usage is a lot lower as well per head. So that's kind of our starting point. I'd note that the question specifically referenced whether more traffic lights would be needed. I think given the very low levels of traffic that we're expecting, traffic lights would seem an overly engineered solution. So we're not expecting those to be needed at all. But as has been previously mentioned, this is relatively early days. We're in conversation with our highways engineer, and they're looking into all of these things and talking to the highway authority as well. So we're working through this.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that, Jane. I don't know whether this is also for you, but Duncan's asked a good question, which is, what is undercroft parking?
That's a good question. I think actually, if you go and look at Watling Court, I think it's got an example of undercroft parking. So when a building that is kind of raised on columns to facilitate parking underneath. So in theory, you're kind of hiding the cars underneath the buildings, and it is something we looked at. We tend to look at lots of options at the beginning, and you've probably seen a few examples with cars parked underneath buildings, and it seems like a good idea. But the problem that is you end up with a very dead perimeter to the building. It's very difficult to get activity and life to the building. So we did look at those options, and that's the reason we put no undercroft parking, because we considered after some kind of investigations that there were disadvantages to that we couldn't really overcome. And I'll come back to that point as well on the next slide.
Yeah, and I think just on this slide that you've got, because you've kind of introduced and it shows that people are interested in your these early stage drawings. Is that there are 5 blocks on that circling the oak? Yes. Is that a set number?
Well, again, there is in our proposals there are 5 blocks. It's been arrived at through a lot of iterations, and that's about building size, and it's also about the number of apartments and homes that you create within each block, and that's thinking about how communities are formed and how many people share a stairwell and share a communal lobby. So there are 5 blocks. That's where we are at the moment. It might change, but it comes from a lot of different factors.
Thank you. That
makes sense.
I know that Sandra was asking, and I know you wanted to move on to the next slide, and we don't want to run out of time, and we're already 6:25.
Okay. I'll keep going. So the other kind of key design objectives is the communal facilities, of which it's many and varied, including potential shared facilities of a restaurant that's available for public access. It makes a lot of sense, and this is sometimes the most obvious things are the best things is to place those at the top of the site, closest to the village, so they're easily accessible, and given the topography as well, they're also at the top of the hill, so it makes a lot of sense. So again, this is just setting out our kind of the starting point of our key objectives. If we go to the next slide. Simple, well-grounded buildings. So that goes back to the undercroft, and that comes out of our looking at whether you could park cars underneath buildings. And we concluded for this project that it wasn't the right solution. And really, well-grounded buildings means when you've got homes on the ground floor, even though the upper floors are maybe accessed from a central stairwell and lift, the homes on the ground floor have front doors that open onto gardens on the ground floor. So there's activity at ground floor. People have little gardens. People who are standing in their gardens, someone's walking past, a conversation happens. So all these things are just not necessarily architectural things, but they are about building that sense of community, and that's where those simple, well-grounded buildings come from. Buildings that last. We're thinking about materials. We're thinking about brick.
Placemaking
and yeah, absolutely, and connections.
I know people are looking at these drawings because we're starting to show some of the kind of building ideas, and people are very curious to know, if we've got any heights in mind, and whether heights in meters is a good way of thinking about buildings.
It is, but I think we're at the stage at the moment where we're looking at site layout. And we're looking at how the buildings are arranged and the forms of the buildings, and I think we're in those discussions. So I think it may be conversations for the next stage.
Okay.
But I would say actually one of the key considerations is trees and tree canopies, and we're looking very carefully at how the buildings sit along the edge of tree canopies and heights. So that's something we're investing in at the moment.
Should help people just at this stage understand the kind of relative.
Absolutely, and the image you just see later again are kind of indicative of a kind of heights you get a feel. And then the last couple of points really just the importance of daylight and wellness. So this goes back to the kind of size of the blocks and how many blocks there are. When you start to think about how many homes there are per floor, there's an optimum to maximize dual aspects. So homes that have different aspects and maximize the opportunity for amenity. So again, that's an important consideration, and that's how we start to plan and arrange buildings on the site. And then certainly not last, as it sits in the bottom there, low carbon, healthy homes and buildings. And that's obviously the key, achieving net zero carbon. And working through that process, which we're doing at the moment, and many methods and investigations we're looking at to achieve that.
I think that will be a question that comes up increasingly, as you say, for the next session, as people start looking at energy costs and energy use.
Okay, we can keep going. Go to the next slide. Okay, so what we're showing here. Apologies, lots of plans to look at. Is a little insight into how we started to sort of develop the ideas for how the site is laid out and how the buildings on the site are laid out. So the first image on the left is where we not arbitrarily we arrived at this idea of these 5 blocks, generally 8 homes per floor, which maximise the opportunity for dual aspect within the apartments. And the first idea is to create a kind of these blocks that form a walled garden around the oak tree, quite a sort of formal arrangement. And in developing those ideas, we were thinking about how those buildings address Watford Road and the best way for them to do that, but also thinking about angling the blocks and angling the buildings to achieve better quality daylight into the site and between the buildings. And then the third plan is just how that then turns itself into an idea about the layout of the blocks. They're kind of split somewhat. Again, that it increases the number of dual aspect flats. It creates a more informal arrangement of these blocks around the oak tree and sets up, which again you'll see as the plans, the next plan appears, the kind of the routes and the opportunities for a more informal kind of routes and connections around the site. So the whole thing goes from a quite formal thing as an idea to something that's quite loose and more appropriate to this site and the topography. Next slide.
Yeah.
And then how we then build those blocks. Those blocks then, two of the blocks connect together to form a kind of this kind of armature or this kind of edge to the east edge of the site towards the village. So that sets up the kind of the edge of communal facilities and sets up the entrance into the site, or the primary kind of pedestrian entrance to the site, provide a welcoming moment, if you're just highlighting there, into the site as you come in, as you start, and as you come along the front of those communals. So they reach out and connect to the village and draw you in, and then draw you into the centre of the site where the oak tree sits.
You've mentioned communal there, and I know that there's a question popped up, and I know that we've got a section on this coming up at the end of the evening, but village hall is something that has been mentioned, and I just thought I'd mention it now to you, Lee, but I'm conscious that we're at risk of running out of time, and so I'm just thinking we've talked through.
Should I do a brief answer on that one, Spencer? Just to say that the idea of accommodating the kinds of community uses that happen in a village hall or community hall is exactly the kind of way that we want to make sure that this development is of use to the existing community of Elstree, and not, not just something that's imposed on it that isn't of use. So, it won't look and feel like maybe a traditional village hall because it'll need to be used all the time. But the kinds of things that would happen in a village hall, we'd be really keen to try and facilitate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that was from Pamela. Sorry, Lee, I interrupted. But, yeah, as a conscious that
we'll keep. I'll so the kind of the middle image really is showing that we introduced a kind of very quiet layer of parking. So again, this is a parking that just slides in between the buildings, and then there's two kind of main areas. So on each end of the site, so sitting behind one area, just sitting on the other side, sitting behind the communals block, and then a sort of connecting route on the left-hand side that sort of skirts around the TPO trees, and then along the kind of northern edge of the site. So the parking's pocketed in smaller clusters, small as we can do as clusters, to minimise the impact of the parking within the site. We're already thinking about ideas of how that parking can be further integrated into the landscape, and with spaces and planting between the car spaces. And then a last layer really is thinking about that not everyone maybe wants to live in an apartment, and there's different things for different people. So it's about providing a variety of homes. And we saw in that kind of the northern finger of the site, there's an opportunity for a very small number of cottages, so individual dwellings, maybe semi-detached, that are kind of well screened and well hidden within the kind of foliage there, but offer a different type of environment for living, so slightly quieter and more secluded as part of the kind of the overall offer within the site and within the landscape. It's so notable that's the area where it's not currently particularly heavily planted. There's opportunities there without considerable damage to vegetation.
Thank you. Next slide.
Okay, next one. So, promise you nearly to the end of the plans. So just the last few plans. This is the kind of proposal as we're kind of we brought it to a kind of a level now. So just to sort of run through those ideas as they kind of gelled together really. So the idea of these 5 villa blocks, as you've seen noted in kind of in sort of browny grey here, around the central oak tree, and the cottages that just run along the kind of the northern strip of the site there, and then the road that kind of connects the cottages forms that moment where you step from I guess a slightly busier area to a much quieter, more secluded area for walks around the kind of wilder areas of the site. And as part of that idea, we're suggesting that within that landscape, there's some little moments, whether it's a deck or a pavilion, there's moments to pause and stop and kind of enjoy the landscape, both within the site and the views. Next slide. And then this is really overlaying the landscape and showing the importance that this is not about this is about spaces between buildings and landscape. It's a landscape-led scheme. And I just wanted to highlight here the top left-hand corner there where it says water. The idea of the water coming into the site here is a really important feature, and it's not only as an attractive feature just within the site, but also to start to deal with the drainage issues within the site, so that having water within the site is a great opportunity to mitigate and create a kind of sustainable drainage system for the site. So water can be managed, and heavy rainfall that can be gathered and slowly drained away. So we're thinking about practical measures at the same time as thinking about how we can create a really fantastic and interesting landscape.
Thank you.
And then the next slide, and it starts to get quite messy, but what we've overlaid here really is that kind of variety of routes that's so important to the scheme. So that opportunity to sort of wander around, and it's multiple different connections and routes around, and you maybe just go off a little walk that starts at one corner and you start to meander and decide you want to walk around the whole site. And there's that facility within this site, which is really quite exciting. And the reason they meander so much is that we're thinking about how they can, the paths can take the topography. So sometimes it's quite steep, so the paths do have to kind of meander, so the gradient isn't too steep, but that can create some great patterns within the landscape. And I think Richard now is just going to talk a little bit more about the character areas that we're kind of looking at for the site.
Will do, Lee. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Hello again, everybody. So this scheme landscape led, you've heard a lot of this. And what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is people like me looking at what makes up the character of the place. And the character of the place is, as Lee has talked about, is its trees, its edge with the Watford Road and the buildings and the build line of the village on two sides, the Roman Road and the High Street, and Watford Road to the south. And then a different quality of an edge on the northern side, looking out to the Alderman Plain and the distant countryside, and then the western side with a large stand of trees, a big group of trees, next to the less dense, more recent development between the Alderman Road and our site boundary at Land's End. And that response to place is really important. It's not about green belt, which Guy has explained is about a planning policy of zoning and constraint with 5 purposes. What we're talking about here is how we make the place belong, how people who live there already still recognize it, and how new residents come in because they've chosen to live here, because they like what they see. And this site for me, it's really easy. Its boundaries are really well defined. There are tree lines around the boundaries, the built environment around the southern side and the eastern side to a lesser degree. I'm really sorry. My puppy has been quiet for an hour and a half. She's just woken up. I'm really sorry about the background. There's not much I can do. But within that, we move into the scheme through an understanding as designers as what are these areas that we want to create, and they are created around what we call the green capital, the retained trees. Some of the views out that look towards the north, but they are restricted by trees. And we've identified as designers 3 broad character zones. The townscape courts that sit more to the south have a stronger relationship with the busier Watford Road, with the built environment and the kind of quiet hubbub that happens sometimes around the High Street. And in the central area, which we call as a working title, a village green. It's not the village green, it's just a working title, but clearly the very large oak, the big oak, it is not the only oak tree. There are many, many oak trees through there, which are an undeniable asset. How do you make best use of those? You invite people in. This will be an open scheme. It won't be gated. These ground layer treatments of paths in, places to sit, places to meet, become progressively quieter and more peaceful as you move away from the Watford Road, down the gentle slope to the northern edge, which will have its planted quality enhanced and retained. There are some very poor quality trees along that edge, and there are some very good ones indeed. At this early stage, the importance of green infrastructure with managing rainwater above ground in rain gardens, biodiversity, the sound of birdsong. This will be a scheme with buildings between the trees. I'm really conscious of time, and I know, Spencer, you're handling the questions. Stop there. And
yeah, no, that's really appreciated, and quite an inspiring explanation of how to make place to suit people by using the environment and the kind of, as you say, the green capital. It sounds very now. So we do still have quite a few questions, and we still have the village walks to just run through.
Do you want us to go on, Spencer? Or do you want to take some questions?
Well, I think there are some key questions which people are asking, and I don't know if we have all the answers, but so the obvious question, of course, from Penny is, so how many units are you proposing, and how many parking spaces? And I think that's for Guy or Andrew.
Yeah, I can talk about it. I mean, I think it's important to say that this is a work in progress, and there's a lot of testing still to be done in terms of the how the heights and layouts and other things work, and whether we are up against any sort of issues that we need to resolve. So the number of homes at this stage isn't fixed. What we know is that these village retirement communities work in the context of sort of 120, 140 homes. So it's that sort of scale that really makes them successful, vibrant places to live. In terms of parking, I think, we know from 16 existing retirement communities that for some of our residents, owning a car remains important to them, particularly initially, whereas for others, by the time they move to a retirement community, owning a car is already something that is in the past for them rather than part of their present, and car ownership sort of tends to drop off quite rapidly over time once these communities establish themselves. So it's less than one car per resident, because we know that would be more than we need to satisfy the parking requirements. Sort of 80%, so eight spaces for every 10 residents, if you want to think about it that way, tends to work roughly for this type of development in this sort of location.
And linked to that, I think, is going back, because a number of people said they've looked at these drawings, and there is a sense of heights. Do we have any kind of more detail on that at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, you can see from the some of the diagrams that we're showing a ground and 3 stories with a roof, and that is the kind of scale, with taller and shorter elements varying around that, which seems to be working on the site. But as I say, that's still to be tested. It's not a foregone conclusion at this stage.
Thank you. And so, in terms of the number of people living within this the integrated scheme, again, can someone give an answer on that?
Yeah. So, looking across our existing communities, on average, our communities are made up of roughly 50% lone women tend to be households, about 25% households are lone men, and then 25% of households are couples. So if you add all that up, you get about 1.25 people per property. So that's how the sums roughly work. Obviously, there's variation around that. You don't dictate, and the customers are varied in different locations, but that's fairly typical.
And so will, obviously when people move in, they'd expect to get visitors, and I know that we've got somebody in the audience who's been asking about visitor parking, and how much of that parking is going to have to spill over onto nearby roads.
Yeah, we wouldn't expect that to be the case at all. So when we look at the number of car parking spaces that are used in our existing communities, that's literally a count of the number of cars that are on the site during the course of a day. So that would take into account residents' cars, staff cars, visitor cars, and any other contractors or businesses that are, deliveries or whatever else. So we then take that number, apply it to the number of homes there are within the development, and we can use that to figure out roughly, what we need for a new development. So, our sums sort of take into account all different types of parking rather than just the resident parking.
Okay, thank you. There is, and I know Andrew answered this to some extent earlier on, but in terms of the kind of services that people need in any village, a GP surgery is clearly something high on people's list. What's RVG's position on supporting GPs?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different ways. I mean, I think one of the concerns is that older people obviously use the GP services disproportionately a lot. That is true, of course, but given that most of the people who will live in this development already live in the area, most of them will already be registered with the local GPs. That said, if the GP surgery does move, that'll become slightly less convenient. We're often asked through the planning system to see how we can support the expansion of GP surgeries, and that's something that we'll consider if it's part of what's required in the area. The other thing that we do accommodate on some of our retirement communities, we actually have what is in effect an outreach surgery within the retirement community. So it's a surgery room connected to the NHS computer systems, and the local GP comes and runs a surgery maybe once a week, which is accessible for our residents, but also other people in the local community. Whether or not that would be part of the business plan of the local surgery here, obviously we can't say yet. We aren't in those discussions, but it's something that does happen on a number of our retirement communities.
I think that would probably be a conversation that local people would like you to have, from the sounds of it, having spoken to people and the questions. I've got to say thank you very much to Duncan, who is asking lots of excellent questions and helping to keep the conversation going. The broad parameters, so is it too soon to start talking about prices if any of these apartments or cottages were to come onto the market?
It is. I think the way to think about pricing is that for us, any retirement community will be successful where it's appropriate to its location. As I've said, the buyers or renters for this development are people who live in the area. So if you think about the value of a typical, modest, not necessarily supersized, 3 or 4 bedroom terrace detached, semi-detached house in the area, when people downsize from that, they want to free up some of the value of that home to pay for, their care, their service charges, play the bank of mum and dad, or the bank of grandma and granddad in some cases. And so they deploy a proportion of the value of that home. So they'll be able to afford to do that. The pricing will enable them to afford to downsize and retain, an element of that capital. So it's tethered to whatever local house prices are at the time when the development comes to the market.
That's an understandable answer without actually giving any figures. I thought I'd say that rather than let Duncan point it out. I think we do have some concerns about the number of vehicles that are likely to be on the site. And I wonder whether there's a way of being able to bring some data in at a later stage, just to help people understand some of the answers that we've had so far.
Absolutely. But so can I just add, what we haven't mentioned is sort of community transport. I mean, I think it's worth saying that at the point at which people choose to move to a retirement community, there's a reason why they've done that. So often that will be associated with not being a driver anymore for some people. But we do also have community transport options on most of our retirement communities, whether that's chauffeur-driven electric MPV or a community minibus, and so we'll be exploring what option works best in this location.
Thank you. That's the other question, of course, is about the timelines. I mean, we've said from the outset that this is very early stages, but do we have any timelines? And then assuming that everything goes to plan, how long would construction last? I think that's probably an Andrew.
I'll take that. Yeah, I mean, basically, obviously we've got the consultations start, and that'll be ongoing for a number of months. In terms of looking at, we might put an application in maybe this side of the new year, probably early new year. There's no fixed date or fixed point we're looking to meet. After that, basically, construction wouldn't start on site really at the very earliest until 2024 sometime. Probably too early. It's too early to say how long, months, build, etc. So that's probably something we could probably say more on as we get through to the next consultation.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good segue into the section that we were talking about earlier, which is on amenity. And if we can just skip through to
if I just while you're skipping through to the side, I mean, I think as being hopefully those on the call and the local community feel this is not in any way a gated community. This will be an open community, both in terms of how people can engage with the scheme, but also in terms of potential facilities we can have on site. So I think Pamela made a suggestion about a village hall. Potentially there are other things to consider as well. For example, in many of our other villages we have a restaurant, and that will be a restaurant open to the public at various times, and that's an ability to go and have a Sunday meal with friends and family. That's important for our residents who come to the site, who live on a site and have places to engage with each other and social interaction, but also again for fostering that sort of community spirit across that as well. So ideas and thoughts we're having at the moment relate to sort of health and fitness aspects, potential treatment rooms. Guys indicated, maybe we might look at sort of a room for a local GP to come and conduct surgeries, gym areas. So I would say welcome to suggestions and for those people living in Elstree who think what they might like to see as well. So do drop if not on the chat today, then do drop suggestions onto the email on the website.
Thank you very much. That saved me from having to say that, although I have no doubt I will say that as well at the very end. I'd like to say, if Will could just skip back to the slide, this slide. I think when this slide was put together, just to give people a sense as to how Lee's design team is thinking about the scheme, and that might help encourage people to come up with suggestions and ideas as to how they would like to see their involvement, as neighbours, as perhaps people with relatives who might want to move in, because I think when people talk about amenity, and on the slide that we were just looking at, we had some examples. There was a shop, there was a kind of fitness classes, and so on. Those are just suggestions, and I suppose as the person that's helping to lead the public engagement, we really do want to hear other suggestions and other ideas, and they may be ideas that you've heard of in other countries or in other parts of the country, or indeed just something that you think would really help bring, as we said earlier, that bit of extra vitality to Elstree. And that would really help integrate the proposals that you've seen the beginnings of this evening. But the more amenity and that kind of shared experience and sense of kind of common enthusiasm for Elstree. Obviously, the more benefits the scheme will be able to deliver, and the stronger the sense of place, which of course will just add to everybody's pleasure of being able to live in somewhere as fantastic as Elstree. So I just thought that I know how much work we put into this particular slide. I thought it was important that we all look at it. I think you only have to imagine that the gentleman sitting in the foreground is reading to his grandchildren who have come to visit. And I think that gives you a sense as the sort of the kind of lifestyle place that we have in mind. But it's very important that we get lots of feedback. And there have been a good number of questions, but I'm very much hoping that we'll get a lot more. And indeed, lots of other feedback through the coming phases of engagement, which takes us through to the next few slides, which will just help me remember. So we've got a website that people can keep up to date with. We have more in-person public engagement events planned for later on in the autumn. The inevitable survey that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and of course our Facebook page, which we will always reply to queries and questions, and so I do recommend that people kind of log on to that. No selfies, and then of course we have our free phone and email, and we'll be developing a newsletter as we go along. We're coming up to the end of the session, and just making sure that I've answered all of the questions that I've seen pop up. We've covered the question of units. We've talked about doctor's surgery. Somebody has pointed out that Hertsmere, Elstree, Borough Wood does have a very high proportion of older people, which we talked about earlier on. And I think that's it. But just to remind everybody, there's one question. It's not a question. It's just a comment about the Aldenham Arms, which I think we might need to come back to because I'm not familiar with where that is. But apparently, it was given planning permission in 2019, but nothing was executed. But that was, I think, just for our guidance. So we will answer all of the questions that come through, and we'll be putting the responses up on the website. This evening has been recorded, and as I said at the beginning, will be made available. And with just a very short time to go before we finish, I would just like to say, any final questions, please type away. Otherwise, thank you very much to Andrew and Guy and Lee and Jane and Richard. Thank you especially to my colleagues, Robert, Will and Amy, who have helped keep me on track. But most importantly, thank you very much to everybody who joined in from Borough Wood and Elstree. Very much look forward to meeting you in person, and wishing you all a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.